Hello and welcome to Interprepedia. My name is Rosa. I'm an interpreter, and I will share with you 10 tips on how to successfully work through an interpreter to communicate with clients who do not speak the same language as you. I'm a certified medical and court interpreter, and I've been interpreting for about 10 years, both remotely and in person. So we can safely say I've had enough experience to tell the difference between what works when it comes to working with interpreters and using the service as a tool to successfully engage with clients and what doesn't. Now, what I'm about to share with you is assuming you'll be working with a professional interpreter, because it is likely that you'll run into bilingual individuals or impromptu interpreters who do not necessarily follow our standards of practice. If you want to learn more about those, I'll share some useful links in the description box. Also, I'm assuming the situation for which you need the interpreter is a regular encounter and not something out of the ordinary, because there are situations where, of course, the usual rules do not apply. Before we get started, I would like to briefly explain how we do our job. First, let's set something straight from the get go. We are interpreters, not translators, not interpretators. Interpreters convey spoken or signed messages from one language into another. Translators convert written messages from one language into another. Interpretators, well, that's a made up word, so please don't call us that. In most situations, we are expected to deliver a pre session where we introduce ourselves and we explain that we will interpret everything that is said, that everything will be confidential. We ask parties to please speak in short sentences and things like that. We interpret in the first person, so if your client says, for example, I need water, we will interpret that as I need water. We will not say he or she says she needs water. That is a big no no. When we interject, we usually say something like, the interpreter needs a repetition, or this is the interpreter speaking, could you please spell that, or something to that effect. It's important to do it because it's the only way to differentiate when I'm speaking on my behalf versus when I'm interpreting the other party's message. Also, we take notes to aid our memory. Not all interpreters do it, and we don't do it in all modalities, but don't be surprised if you see an interpreter taking notes. The two most common modalities for interpretation are simultaneous and consecutive. Simultaneous interpretation is when we interpret in real time what is being said, and consecutive interpretation is when a speaker says something and then pauses for us to interpret that, and then the other person replies and pauses for us to interpret that back, and so on. Now let's dive into those tips that will help you make the most of your interpretation services and engage with your clients. Number one is context is everything. Let's switch places for a second. Imagine that you are an interpreter and you pick up the phone to interpret for me. After our greetings, I simply say, well, as I was saying, that's light, without giving you any context, and you're supposed to tell another person what I meant. You would probably need to ask for clarification because you won't know if what I meant was something isn't heavy or isn't dark or is low carb, or if I'm referring to something that illuminates. Now imagine that I tell you at the beginning of the call that I am a nutritionist and that I am talking to my patient about healthier food choices for her diabetes. Then I say, well, as I was saying, yes, that's light. That would most likely lead you to the right meaning. So, context is everything, and you need to brief the interpreter beforehand. Doing so is very simple. You can say something simple like, I need to get this patient's consent for anesthesia, or I need to explain to my client the details of a plea deal for a DUI, because it would help us a lot to get situated. If you are booking the interpretation service ahead of time, even better, just make sure you include those details when you request the interpreter. Make sure you send the interpreter presentation slides and any scripts that will be read. If you are meeting with a client and there will be forms to be filled out or documents to review, redact them if needed to protect the client's confidentiality, but whenever possible, send them to the interpreter ahead of time. If there's a meeting with multiple parties, giving an interpreter a piece of paper with a list of names and job titles would help greatly. Talk directly to your client as you would talk to them if you spoke the same language. There is no need to constantly say to the interpreter, can you ask my patient this? Or can you tell him this? Tell her that. If it's an in person encounter, position yourself as you would if the client spoke the same language as you, and make sure to make eye contact. When you speak, speaking a little slower is the best thing you can do. Also, make sure your volume is adequate. However, there is no need to shout. Just slow down and articulate your words as best as you can, especially nowadays because everybody is wearing masks and words sound very muffled. Try to be mindful of your vocabulary and avoid using acronyms unless you explain at least once what it stands for, and avoid using jargon or idioms as much as possible. To make sure the message is getting across clearly, try to ask your client to explain or retell in their own words what has been said. Do so frequently during the encounter and not just at the very end so that you can correct any misunderstandings noted. Everything you say has to be interpreted into another language, and everything the other party says has to be interpreted back to you. A regular appointment may take twice as long if there is an interpreter involved. Some interpreters or agencies have overtime fees that can be expensive, or the interpreter may have another appointment right after yours, so make sure to plan your time accordingly. If the time you scheduled for the interpreter is coming to an end, we appreciate the courtesy of you stopping briefly to check if we are available to continue past that time. Also, if you're using an on demand interpreting service where you call in via phone or video and get an interpreter on the spot, please check the interpreter's availability if your call will last more than 30 minutes. We are interpreters, so please avoid giving the interpreter other tasks like escorting clients to other areas or giving people rides or things like that. Avoid leaving the interpreter alone with the other party because most likely they will ask questions that we are not allowed to or qualified to answer. Also, we are expected to be impartial and to follow standards of practice. Plus, doing things like that can be a liability for the interpreter and for you or your institution in some situations. As interpreters, we are trained to control the flow of conversation by asking parties to slow down or to speak in shorter phrases, but you can control the conversation too if it's not adequate. For example, if you are asking your client questions that should be answered with a yes or no, and they are going on a never ending tangent, feel free to intervene and let your client know through the interpreter if necessary. Remember, our main job is to interpret messages maintaining the same meaning, spirit, tone, and register. That means that there may be times we have to convey insults or messages that are not very clear, so please keep that in mind. It's not our message, we are simply conveying that message. Also, although part of our job is to assist in communication, breaking language and cultural barriers, that doesn't mean the other party will fully understand what is being said in spite of our best efforts. So that's why one of my previous recommendations was to make sure you check for understanding. As interpreters, we are expected to be unbiased and impartial parties in any encounter, so please keep that in mind because a professional interpreter will not take sides or favor one side over another. I hope that learning this information will empower you to make the most of your encounters where there's an interpreter involved and that it can help you be more successful in communicating with your clients. If you have questions or if you have a special request for me to make a video in the future, please let me know in the comments. And thank you so much for watching. Adios.